So yeah, Visual Studio Code. It's an editor I've used for several years now. Quickly became my favorite. So editors are definitely something that tend to evoke a lot of emotion. Everybody has a favorite and will defend it to the death. So whether you go for simplicity, something like VI, or something that's a little heavier, something like Notepad++, I know is still a favorite, or even heavier than that, something maybe like NetBeans or Eclipse. But as I said, VS Code was something that took me a little while to get used to, but once I started using it regularly and got comfortable with it, I rarely use anything else now. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about the editor. It's a solid editor on its own, but where it really shines is its extension support, added functionality through the extension library. And which is why I call it the Swiss Army knife of editors. So the editor itself, it's a cross-platform editor. You get the same experience on Linux, Mac, or Windows, built using the Electron framework and based originally on Atom, which is an editor that was created by GitHub. So if you ever use Atom, you'll definitely see tons of similarities. Atom, I believe, is discontinued now, and it never really gained the extension support that VS Code has. The source code for VS Code is available if you want to see it, want to work with it. It was also voted the most popular IDE in the 2021 Stack Overflow Developer Survey, and I think it was the favorite in 2020 as well. Installation is at code.visualstudio.com. We'll go here briefly.
Do you mind if I put these out here so people can...
I don't mind at all. I've lost the crowd now, though. So go to code.visualstudio.com. It will identify the operating system that you're on and present the appropriate download for you, but you can choose others. And then there is also an Insider's Edition if you want more bleeding edge features. I always download the LTS. So yeah, I lost my screen. Hold on. Oh, because I navigated away from it. So as I said, available for multiple operating systems with the same behaviors on all of those operating systems, which also makes it really nice. You can set up identical. You can have identical setups on different machines and different operating systems. Do work on Windows at one location, switch over to work under Linux at another location, and have exactly the same experience, both from the editor and from any extensions that you have installed, which is really nice. So it's not, you don't play any of the, well, okay, I know how to do this in Windows, but I don't know how it does it in Linux. Everything I've seen is identical. So before we get into extensions, we'll talk a little bit about what comes baked into the editor. So let me switch over here. When you have the editor running, in your panel over here to the left, by default, you'll have the Explorer that shows you either an individual file that you have open, or if you've opened a folder, it'll show you a tree view of that folder. You have a global search and replace if you want it. You have built-in source control, which is really handy. So if you are opening a folder that is Git managed, it will automatically see that and let you just do the normal things that you would do with Git. So you can do commits. You can stage commits. You can do push and pull. You can do diffs, all from within the UI. And we'll touch on all that a little bit more later. You have the debugger tab. If you have a folder open with a project that has debugger support, either intrinsic or through an extension, then you've got your typical debugger type functions here. setting breakpoints, watching the stack, and so on. And then finally, you have the actual extension panel, where you can see the extensions that you have installed and then search for other extensions that you're interested in, along with recommendations. So as you install extensions, it will update this recommended tab based on what you already have installed. It's a bit like the Amazon algorithm. Some of them you'll go, what? But still pretty nice. And then, before I go any further, actually what I think is the most important, what you definitely want to get used to, and it's something that took me a while to start using, because it's different than what I'm used to, and that's the command palette. Once I got comfortable with it, I barely go anywhere else to select commands, just because it's a one-stop shop. You don't go searching through menus trying to figure out how to do something. You just hit F1, you get the command palette, you just start typing part of the name for whatever you want to do, and as you use commands in the command palette, most used commands remain first in the list. So if, for example, you are running the debugger, and so you've got your project open, you hit F1 to bring up your palette, and you say, okay, let me try this again. You say run, and you find the command you want. Okay, so view, show, run, and debug. So I found it, and I use it, but if I'm using it continuously, once I've selected it the first time, every time I hit F1, it'll be first in the list. So you can come back to it quickly. But every single command that is available to you, both through the editor and any commands that are available through installed extensions, I can make words, are all available in the command palette. Visual Studio Code is not project-based, it's directory-based. And what I mean by that is when you're working with a project in Visual Studio Code, you don't go into Visual Studio Code, say, create a new project, name a project file, add files to the project. You just point VS Code to a directory and open it, and that's magically a project. And it's a project that it will remember. I like this as well because it's not all that minutia of setting up a project, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's say that you have an existing project. I've got a project here that I've pulled down from GitHub working with the Habersign formula. So this is a GitHub project. It's already in a folder on my machine. So I just right-click on that folder. I say open with Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code says, okay, that's open now. Everything that's in that folder is in this list over here to the side. Apparently I've had it open before because it's already got my main open. Now when I close that, I have two instances open, so I'm going to close this one as well. Next time I come into VS Code, you'll notice that I didn't do anything special to set up that project. I just right-clicked on a folder and I opened it. Now, as soon as I come back in my recent list, oh, okay, here's the most recent project that you had open was the Habersign project here in Documents Projects. I can just click on it, and I'm right back where I was. That's all the effort you have in setting up a project in VS Code.
If you create a new project, does it do the scaffolding for you? Or do you have to dig all the folders?
That's a good question. I have never done that. I have never initiated creation of a project from inside VS Code. I always create my project because it works with so many different project types that I just go through my normal steps of creating it outside. Like if I'm working with .NET, I'll go new up a project with the .NET CLI. Or if I'm working with Python, I'll probably just open a folder and then create a new file inside the folder that becomes a project. But as far as doing it from scratch inside VS Code, I haven't done it. Another feature that VS Code has is dynamic language mode. And you'll see similar functionality inside other editors, where normally when you open a file, the first thing close. Okay, it's refusing. 1 second. Try that. There we go. Okay, so when you open a file inside VS Code, normally it will look at as every editor does, it looks at the file extension and tries to determine what the type is. But if you have a special situation and where something like this might crop up would be, for example, let's say you have an application that's logging in JSON format, but the log file has a different extension. So I've got this text file here, looks like JSON. If I open that with Visual Studio Code, it's got JSON in it, but it's got a text extension. So it says, oh, well, obviously that's plain text. So it's not going to do any kind of syntax highlighting, won't let you navigate it as JSON, but you can dynamically tell it what the file is by going to your command palette and just do language mode. Select the language type that you want. Okay, now it highlights the contents as JSON syntax. And if I go to the symbol browser, which the symbol browser, shortcut to that inside VS Code is Control-Shift-O. If you do Control-Shift-O and it is a file type that it knows how to interpret the symbols in, then you get a browser. So now, even though that's a text file, I've told VS Code that it's JSON and it will treat it as such. And then something else to be aware of, and this is fairly recent. I think it's like within the last couple of versions of VS Code, they've added trusted code mode. So whenever you open a folder for the first time, you'll just get a prompt asking if you trust the contents of that folder, and then it remembers it. So then subsequently, when you open that folder again, it'll remember that you trusted it and won't prompt you again. It's not very intrusive. All that does is, let me create a throwaway folder. So I've never opened this folder, obviously, because I just created it. So if I open that in Visual Studio Code, it says, oh, okay, haven't seen this before. Do you trust this? I say yes. And then it will trust me in the future.
What happens when we say no?
That's a good question. I think it will show the files, but not let. Yeah, I don't have a build profile set up. I'll do a simpler one and just do a Python. So if I F5, so now it says, okay, you're not going to, you called it. So it's not going to let me do anything further. It's like, at this point, you're actually trying to run it. So before I let you go any further, you're going to have to trust the file. So now I know. Thank you. You know exactly where it stops, where restricted mode says, you're done. Okay. Trusted code. Okay, so moving on. So now we'll actually talk about extensions. And I think this is really what permanently drew me into VS Code is that extension support just grew astronomically and really rapidly, to the point where you can find an extension for just about anything you want to do now. And we know what that means because it's the ecosystem that matters, really, for any kind of tool. I just came up with a list here off the top of my head. It's like, think about almost any of your favorite languages or compilers, and think about how useful they'd be if you didn't have that library support. Well, you can read the list. Just think about using .NET if you didn't have NuGet, or Python without PyPy, or any of these ecosystems without that support around them. And they become not useless, but certainly a lot more difficult. You're doing everything from scratch, or just not using it at all. And now we'll go through some specific extensions. Starting with .NET, we have the C# extension that is actually built and maintained by Microsoft. The dependency management and the language services are provided by something called OmniSharp, all maintained by Microsoft, which makes for some interesting contention inside Microsoft, because the C# extension has grown in functionality to the point where it's starting to cannibalize Visual Studio. There is so much you can do with the free VS Code and C# extension. A lot of developers are moving to that without the need to use Visual Studio. So there might be some warning signs here, given that OmniSharp is maintained by Microsoft. Depending on which voices prevail, that might not get quite as much attention in the future. We'll just have to see how that plays out.
Do you use OmniSharp?
I do use the C# extension, which gives you OmniSharp. So
I'm behind the firewall, and that frequently seems to have trouble with getting through the firewall for either updates or something.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't think to mention that because I haven't had to deal with it recently. I did when I was at CareSource. There is a setting. It's a single setting, and I'm not going to make you watch while I look for it, but I'll follow up. But it was the first thing I did whenever I was setting up a new instance at CareSource. But it's a single option inside VS Code that will open that. I know what it is. What it controls is the cert. But the reason that updates fail is because VS Code says, this cert doesn't match. It's because it looks like a man in the middle attack to VS Code, when it's really just the corporate cert that's controlling all the traffic going through that.
You might experience that also if you're using like a VPN, like a NordVPN or something like that.
Okay. I haven't encountered issues through a VPN, so I don't know about that. But you're right. On the corporate network, basically it's a setting that says, I don't remember the exact wording, but it's ignore cert errors. As soon as you enable that, extension updates work and those other issues are resolved. So thanks for bringing that up. Let's see, I will actually need to create one, which I will do. I'll just do a simple console. So I'm just genning up a simple .NET console app that we're going to open in VS Code.
What you just did is probably one of my favorite things, because I do all of my my gets from a bash shell, and then every time I have a merge conflict, I do a code dot to do my merge conflict.
I shouldn't have blown right past that, but yes, another great and handy feature is it can be launched straight from the command line. Okay, so now a couple things will happen. I'm opening a .NET project for the first time. So here in a moment, I'm going to get a prompt. I will eventually get a prompt on my tired old laptop. There we go. So given that it is a .NET project, it recognizes that and said, okay, this is the first time you've opened this .NET project inside VS Code, so there's a few things that I need to set up in order to know how to run it. So it just says, do you want to do that now? You say yes, and then it will create a .VS Code folder, in a subdirectory in that project folder, and all that has is some information about how to launch it and build tasks.
That should be added to your Git ignore, shouldn't it?
Which, yes, you're right. Because if anytime you open that on a new instance of it, like on a new machine or whatever, you'll just get the one prompt. There's nothing manual that you have to do here. It just asks for permission to set it up. It adds all the required entries, and you're good to go. So now that that's added, when I open this up, you'll get a lot of the same behaviors that you'll see inside Visual Studio. You see your little like references tags. You will get pop-up help. You can click through to see metadata, and you can just run using the old familiar F5 just as you would inside Visual Studio. So it'll run this. We should get a hello world here in the terminal panel here. And there's our hello world. You can tell by all the additional information you got that we're running in debug mode, which that's in place as well. If you set breakpoints, they'll behave just as you would expect. If I ran again, we'd stop here. I can step, do all the normal debugger type stuff. You can set watches, view the call stack, all those same goodies that you would have inside Visual Studio. So while we're here, another extension, I don't use this a ton, but it's handy sometimes, is it's an extension that's confusingly named C# extensions. And it just adds a few templates for doing things like creating classes, interface, class constructors. It's got some property templates in there. When you have C# extensions loaded, when you're in VS Code and you're in the Explorer view, I can right-click here. It adds these options right here. Add a new class, add a new interface, and it just scaffolds that out a little bit. If you are inside an existing class, you'll get options for construct a property, things like that.
So would that update the CS proj? If you're inside of a project and you add that way, would that update the manifest of the CS proj?
It must, because if you end up with something that's runnable. Let me just do this. Oops. I really need to turn my touchpad off.
Sorry, I keep derailing you.
No, that's all right. You're raising good questions. All right, so we've got our class. Oh no, okay. It doesn't have to here. Yeah. It's just because it's just going to resolve at runtime any references that I have without the need for it to exist inside the proj. Now, if you've got it spelled out in something like a yeah, I'd have to play with that a little bit more. But But again, you just watch me experiment. Nobody wants that. But given that I've added this class file now, if I go over here, you can see that it matched it up with the same namespace. I've got program here with console test namespace, and then I've got my class with the same namespace, and it will be accessible from program.cs. And then finally, and this one had to make a correction. This is an extension that I've used for a long time, and only recently found out that it's not needed anymore. Used to have to install this separate. I do a lot of XML documentation inside my code because I like to have it in place. It gives you niceties like when you're inside the editor, you get nice pop-up help based on the XML documentation comments. And then you can also use things like Doxygen for generating standalone API documentation. So I tend to use XML comments a lot. And this C# XML documentation comments extension used to do pre-fills for you. Like if you had a method open, I'll just show you. You have a method open and you start typing your 3 slashes, it fills it in for you. So now you've got the required tags in place, it identifies the parameters, and then I can just fill in my text. This is the main. So you don't have to type it all out by hand. But that separate extension is no longer needed. If you have the Microsoft C# extension installed, it includes support for the templating on the XML contents. So then we see we've got our nice little pop-up help there on main saying that this is the main. It's a little bit of a time saver. Okay, so I won't walk through an entire example here. I'll just say that with the C and C extension, also built and maintained by Microsoft, it's effectively the same kind of support. When you have the extension installed, then you can do build profiles, you get IntelliSense, you get the symbol browser, all those same goodies that the C# extension adds for C#. And then it's smart about looking to see what compiler or compilers. If you have multiple compilers installed on your system, when you're setting up a build profile, it'll prompt you, asking you which compiler you want to use. For C and C++, the only other extension I've used is Clang format. With the C and C++ extension alone, it includes a formatter, a beautifier. But if, for example, you want to use the formatting that Clang, because I tend to use Clang format, and the built-in formatter inside VS Code doesn't follow exactly the same rules, and you can do a lot of tweaking and manipulating to try to get them to match. But if you're depending on Clang format outside, like if you're using makefiles or something like that with Clang format, just install the Clang format extension. It actually calls the Clang format CLI, and then you'll get consistent formatting, whether you're inside or outside of VS Code. The Docker extension, as you would imagine, lets you manage Docker containers and images inside VS Code. So let's go back over here. Close this workspace. I already have the Docker extension installed. It adds this icon over here in my side panel. If you have Docker itself installed on your system, then the Docker extension will automatically interrogate that setup to see what you have configured. So if I open this, right now I only have one image with one container that I've set up. It's actually for SQL Server because we're going to be talking about that extension as well. So we'll see that it identifies the SQL Server image, tells me which version I have installed, and then any containers that I've created based on that. Lets you do a few odds and ends here with things like view any logs that are being created by the running container, lets you start up the container. If the container is running, it will also let you browse the contents of the container. All stuff you can do from the command line, but just a little bit friendlier with this view inside here. Here's another one that I use a lot just because it's so friendly. If you're working with CSV files, I'm going to close this and we're going to go back over here to our, let me get out of this. We're going to go back over here to our project folders where I already have a CSV file, and we're going to open that CSV test folder inside Visual Studio Code. Now by default, without the extension, when you open a CSV file, it's just a raw CSV file. It's text with commas or whatever delimiter you're using. But if you have the Edit CSV extension installed, you'll get an extra button over here. And when you have that CSV file open in the raw file open in the editor, you can hit Edit CSV and you get a nice Excel type view. Now, I don't have it defaulting to headers, so it thinks my header row is part of the data, but that's easy to fix. Just open Read Options, tell it you have a header, and close it. And now I can work with it in this cell view.
Thank you.
So
I needed that.
See, that's what I was hoping. I was hoping I would introduce at least a few where somebody would go, oh, that solves a problem for me. So.
We're actually exporting the CSV as a DAT file, so it's just a simple matter of renaming it to CSV and boom.
You don't have to rename it. Open the DAT file in VS Code, go to language mode that I showed earlier, tell it it's a CSV, your edit CSV will show up and you're good to go. So inside this view then I can make some changes. Like I'm going to change this 0 here to 25, and if I apply the changes, and I can switch back and forth. If I'm in here and I switch back over to this view, you see this is now 25. If I go here and I say, oops, it's really supposed to be 30, and while I'm over here, I'll just change it real quick and save it. And then when I go back over here, now it's 30. So they keep each other synced up, which is pretty nice. But that's just one of those things that you're probably not going to need it every day. But I was working with CSV files at CareSource, I might add. I was working with CSV files, and so I thought, oh, I'll bet there's an extension that'll make this easier. Found that, and it made my life a lot easier. So.
I don't know if you're talking about this, but I also use something similar, which is a Markdown preview. So it'll format your Markdown for you to preview.
We're getting to that.
Oh, sorry.
Exact same situation though. It was another one of those. Like once I found it and started using it, it's where have you been all my life? So okay, moving on. GitLens. Now we already talked a little bit about the built-in support for Git, and you can configure it for other providers too. But the default is Git. If I open a folder that is Git managed, now first, and this can get a little tricky, there is so much that's baked into the editor. The lines easily blur between, okay, what did the extension add for me versus what was already available to me inside VS Code. So It's very easy to just disable extensions on the fly without uninstalling them. So that's what I tend to do. If I'm working with a new extension and want to see what it does for me, I'll just, no, I don't care about that. I will just toggle it on and off and see kind of what appears and disappears. So when I've opened a folder here that's got a Git managed project, I go over here. Now this is the built-in functionality. I haven't installed any extensions to get this. It's always here, the source control option. So it'll show me any outstanding changes that I've made since I pulled the project. If I go in here and make a change, I will just make a throwaway change. Save that. This should it refreshes automatically because I've made a change inside main.rs. It says, okay, there's a modification to main.rs. I can revert that change. I can stage it. I can commit it. If I click on it in this view, I get a diff, so I can see what I actually changed. Again, this is all the built-in. This is all nothing new here, nothing extension-driven. This is all built-in. Now, what GitLens does is, first of all, what you see right here, this little tag that's added, and when I hover, it gives me additional information. GitLens is providing this to me. So it's saying, okay, I see there's a modification here. You made it a few seconds ago. Actually, you made it at 6:50 p.m. today. So little bit more information on the fly without having to go over here. As I walk through the rest of the code down here that I haven't modified, when I click on a line, it says, okay, this particular line was last modified. It's not an uncommitted change. It was last modified by you 6 days ago, and when you committed it, you added the comment added Rust example. So that's pretty nice. Just as you move along, you'll see that update depending on which line you're on, and show. Yeah, it's pretty handy. And then it also adds this GitLens option over here in the panel that just gives you a whole load of extra information. Some of this is available here, but some of it is not. Stashes, something I happen to use quite a bit inside Git. So if you want to keep track of any stashes that you've created, they'll show up here. But yeah, loads of extra info. So definitely not required because the support you get built in is really nice. But if you want a little bit more, you might want to check out GitLens as well.
Is the merge, is that part of GitLens or is that baked in?
Merge is baked in. GitLens might, see now it's back to those, does GitLens add to that? Maybe.
It is so nice to be able to see a conflict and then you say
how to resolve it and
yeah.
take this or this. Exactly. And yeah, that's, I'm pretty confident that that's built in, but I haven't used that for a while inside VS Code, so don't hold me to it. Okay, JSON tools. So this is another one that JSON support that's built into VS Code is really good. You get syntax highlighting just like you get with almost every other file. And then you also get the symbol browser that's built in. But what the JSON tools add is a beautifier and a minifier. So if you are working with JSON, we'll open up the sample here. You can, all right, let's say that I've made some changes here. It's not formatted very well. It's well formed, but the formatting is not great. you can prettify it. Everything's lined up nice. Or if you are to where you want to deploy it somewhere where you don't need it to look nice, you just want to make it as concise or as compressed as you can, then you have the option to do the minify. If I minify, then it flattens it. That's all it is. Not a lot to that one, but again, if you're working with JSON on a regular basis, there's some nice features to have. And then baked in, you have the normal symbol browser, like so. Here's another one that I love. Live preview is really, really nice. When you are, what I use it for 99% of the time is just, I'm trying to remember how to do a thing in HTML, or I'm trying to remember how to do a thing in JavaScript or something, and so it's, I just need a quick, let me try this out. That's not quite right. Let me try this. Live preview is really nice for that, and I'll show you why. This is a fairly new extension. This is another one that, it's another one from Microsoft. Came out within the last couple of releases of VS Code, I believe.
Are you running your slideshow from live preview?
No, it's just static. But I could if I want. I could if I wanted to. I was using it when I was working on it, and I'll show you why. Because it's called live preview for a reason. If you have, so you have HTML previewers that just say, okay, I know the syntax of HTML and I can render it for you. But live preview takes it a little bit further and actually spins up a local server. So if you're working with HTML and you've got the live preview extension installed, you hover over, oops, wrong one. Over here you see live preview. When I click that, I get a preview panel. Couple of other things you can do here is you can have this launch into an external browser, which is what I usually do just for the sake of real estate. So if you don't want it to, if you want them side by side and want to instantly see your results, it's kind of nice to have it built in. But if you want a little more screen real estate, want to have a full screen editor and a full screen preview, there's a setting for the extension that you can tell it just launch external instead of using internal. The default behavior, which I actually don't like, is show changes immediately. And I quickly turn that off because I don't like it. Because usually I'm writing broken JavaScript and I don't really want to preview it until I'm finished writing the JavaScript. Now see, did I turn, I haven't turned it off in this instance yet. So you'll see literally as I type, it shows up over in my preview. Don't have to save it, but there is a setting that says preview on save, and then I can just make my changes. As soon as I hit save, then it'll refresh the server and show me my changes. That's up to you. That's a setting that you can toggle. So again, really nice. It's really nice when you're, like I said, playing with something like JavaScript. It's also really nice if you're experimenting with CSS. Even though CSS always just works, and you never ever have to tinker with that at all to make it look good. Sarcasm. So that's really nice for that. Let's see, did I cover? Yep, preview, runs a local server, and hot loads your changes. Markdown shortcuts. Now, again, like so many other things, there's the what VS Code provides versus what this extension will actually give you. Now, Markdown Preview is built in to VS Code. You don't have to load an extension for that. So if I'm over here, where's my Markdown? If I've got Markdown open inside Visual Studio Code, actually it works very similar to Live Preview. When you have Markdown, oh, I thought I had an example in here. I guess I'll have to create one. So when you've got Markdown open, if you hover over here, it says Open Preview. Opens a panel very similar to that Live Preview we just saw for HTML. And as I write my Markdown, I get the Live Preview over to the side. So that's built in. But what's not built in is, okay, what's the syntax for doing a table? What's the syntax for doing a quotation? I can't remember. Well, Markdown shortcuts will give you help with that. When you have Markdown shortcuts extension installed, you do Control-M, Control-M, just twice in a row, and you get a pop-up that gives you commonly used Markdown. And table is a great example because it will give you a very nice table example that you can then modify to suit whatever you need. You can have it inject the example, and then you can look and, oh, okay, that's how you identify the headers, that's how you separate it from the detail, all that minutia that if you're not using Markdown all the time, that's easy to forget. It will also let you mark selected text. So let's say, let me just wipe out my table. Let's say I want to make this bold. You can highlight that, Control-M, Control-M. Yeah, I know bold's not a difficult one, but if you happen to forget, do that. It'll add the tags for you, and now you've got bold. So the list is pretty nice. You can do code blocks, hyperlinks, 6 levels of titles, list of checkboxes, and then of course the tables, and then your standard bold, italics, strike through, and so on. So again, nice little reminder if you forget individual syntax. Open in browser is basically Live Preview without the server. So if you have code, if you have HTML that's fairly simple HTML, it doesn't require a server, you can just use Open in browser. And it treats it like it treats if you do file open from your browser. So you don't have a server running, it's just the browser interpreting the HTML to the best of its ability and displaying it. Nice for quick previews if you don't want to run the live server. Anybody use PHP? Admit it. Okay, thank you. I actually like PHP. Now everybody knows. So PHP again. I won't go through the example because it's similar to what we've seen already. Adds the typical IntelliSense pop-up help, syntax help. Just the various things that we already saw added for the C# and for our other languages. So if you're using PHP on a regular basis, the IntelliSense, their logo is a little elephant. The PHP IntelliSense will add lots of goodies to help you out. And same for Java. Spending quite a bit of time in here, so I'm kind of just going through these quickly. If anybody wants to see these in action, I will stop and run them. But I can tell you that Java is just one more example. The Java support is actually really similar to what we saw with the C#. With the language support for Java, along with the debugger, really interesting that the language support extension is provided by Red Hat, and then the debugger is provided by Microsoft. But with if you're working with Java inside VS Code on a regular basis, there are loads and loads of Java extensions, but I really consider those the two that are basically required. Because you get, as you'd expect, the syntax help, the IntelliSense and all that. And then the debugger, you actually get debugger support, so you can debug Java source inside VS Code. The Python extensions, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's the same thing. With Python extensions, also made by Microsoft. Microsoft is extremely active inside the VS Code extension community. You're right back to you get symbol browsing, IntelliSense, the usual suspects. Now, with Python, and you'll see this with a lot of other extensions as well, they're not necessarily standalone extensions. Quite often when you install a given extension to get support for something that you want, you'll see one or more additional extensions get installed along with it. In the case of Python, Python is actually getting pretty busy, because when you install the Microsoft Python extension, the first thing it does is it also installs the Pylance language server that involves all the stuff you'd expect a language server to do. But then, and I found this one a little odd, is it will just go ahead and install Jupyter support. Now, Jupyter support is a nice to have, but I did kind of find that odd that sort of seems like maybe it should be your choice. You may want to work with Python, but not necessarily work with Jupyter. But they decided for you. And this is actually an example. This is definitely one of my favorite extensions, because I like Jupyter. I like what Jupyter can produce for you or let you build, but I've always found Jupyter itself to be pretty cumbersome to use. Difficult to set up the Jupyter server, kind of difficult to navigate your way around inside Jupyter. Great what you can produce with it, but just not that friendly to use, and so I didn't use it all that much. They have really, really made it easy to start using Jupyter if you just do it inside VS Code. And I'll show you what I mean. So I think this is an empty folder. I don't think I have a file in here yet. If I open up the Jupyter folder, so right now it's named Jupyter, but VS Code doesn't know anything about it because it doesn't have any contents. If I just right click and do new file, name it whatever I want, but with a IPYNB extension for that Jupyter recognizes. With the Jupyter extension installed, VS Code just says, oh, that's a Jupyter notebook. Let me just format that accordingly. So all I had to do was just create an empty file with that extension. It adds all the Jupyter functions and gives me a starter panel, and I can just start writing Python code. So we'll keep it simple. Big fan of the classics. Okay, so I've written some Python code. I can run that. This I don't know. I did something strange with my setup, but it's seeing the same Python in two different locations, so I have to tell it which one of the same thing that I want. You only get this prompt once. Soon as I select my Python interpreter, it will start up the Python, the iKernel, run my Python code, and there's my hello world. And I will add some markdown. this guy. Oops. I will move this guy up. Okay. I'll try to move this guy. I'll just move this guy down. Okay. So now when I run all, it will interpret the markdown. I mean, it's what Jupyter does. You know, whenever you run, it interprets markdown, renders it, it interprets the code, runs it, shows you the results. You can also export, if I can remember here we go. So when I've created my Jupyter notebook and I'm happy with how it looks and I want to share it, I'll do export and I'm going to do HTML. So it's exporting to HTML. It's defaulting to the same directory, so I will just put it right here. And here is a great example of why I like to live inside VS Code. It's usually not a good idea, in my mind at least, to do one-stop shopping. I'm going to find a tool that does everything. That's usually a bad idea because individual experiences for those features vary in quality. VS Code is one of those that I think kind of breaks the mold, where it's usually pretty nice to get a setup where you can remain inside VS Code. Because I'm using the Jupyter extension to create my Jupyter notebook. I've exported it to HTML. Now that I have HTML, I can go open the HTML, go use my live preview extension, and see my exported notebook. So I've been able to leverage multiple extensions, staying within VS Code to kind of go all the way from create my Jupyter notebook, produce my output, verify my output. And again, yeah, so kind of continuing on to the don't be alarmed if you install an extension and you get lots of extensions. So you install Python and you get Pylance and you get Jupyter and you get Jupyter Keymap and Jupyter Notebook Renderers and probably a few others that I've forgotten about that all get added as individual extensions inside your extension list. Here's another one I love. So if you're working with REST APIs, which probably anybody, everybody, everyone. If you're working with REST APIs, you're probably using something like Postman. You might be using Insomnia. If you've been bad, Santa might have brought you Soap UI, but again, CareSource. Yeah, I started with Soap UI, and then Postman was the greatest thing that ever happened to me until I found REST Client. Once I found REST Client, I use it as much as I possibly can. Postman is really nice. It's really powerful. You can do so much with it, but a lot of the functionality is tucked away inside the UI. So you're working your way around the UI, finding the different pieces, parts that you want. The REST Client extension inside VS Code lets you write your entire REST test as a single plain text file. You're not looking for functionality inside the UI, you're just writing it like a script. And I'll show you a simple example. So let's close this guy. And I'm going to, where are you at? I'm going to open REST test. I don't think I have anything in here yet. I do not. Okay. So first we need a REST service. So I'm going to jump out here and just create a simple boilerplate, whatever default .NET gives me for a web API project. So I'll just do .NET new web API, and That should do it. So the nice thing about generating a web API project with .NET is it gives you a little boilerplate in there. It actually sets up a default GET endpoint for you. So we get a very simple API that we can just, or REST service that we can just run right out of the gate. So I'm going to switch over here to my REST test proj. Okay, there we go. We'll do .NET run. Should be all we have to do. There we go. Okay, so our service is running now, running on localhost 5001. I'm actually going to launch that. And when I do, we will see nothing. Well, first we'll get a warning because it's a self-generated cert, self-signed cert. But then we don't see anything because we're not at our endpoint. It's launched the root URL, but it's not launched it to the endpoint, so we won't have anything to see. If we actually wanted to see, I happen to know that the default that .NET New creates for you now, it creates a weather forecast GET endpoint. So if we want, we can actually navigate to that and see it, and there's our results, and it interprets the JSON. But to test that inside REST client, if we go over here and the REST test files have a HTTP extension. So I'll just do new file, test.http. Now all I have to do is give it some commands that the REST client extension understands. And I'll do that by just typing a verb. I know I want to test a GET, so which I can just do GET and fill in the details myself. They also include some nice sample blocks. So if I use a sample block instead, the GET is not that complex. If you do things like post, you'll get a more comprehensive example. So I've got my GET. It's telling it it's HTTP 1.1, and then I have to fill in my URL. Now, as soon as I typed my verb, the extension says, oh, okay, you're starting a request here, so it adds a decorator here for sending the request. So once I have this in place, I can just hit send request, and my socket hangs up for some reason.
You need to ask on HTTP. Your HTTP is
Did
on
it publish it as? Oh, it did. You're right, because it had the cert error. Thank you. So when you get your URL correct and you send your request, we get the same results that we got over in the browser, except it adds a little bit more information about the response, the HTTP response that you got, letting you know the state of the connection, when it was sent, what your content type is, a little bit of extra info, and then some nicely formatted JSON. You can do, I don't remember the entire verb list, but the usual suspects, of course, gets, puts, posts, deletes, and more, as I recall. And if you're doing something like a post, you can do all of the content of your post in line as a part of your script. You can separate multiple tests. I think it's the 3 pound signs. So if I've got a whole series of tests I want to do inside one file, I can write them and separate them. I can send them individually. I can submit the whole set. And then something else that this will let you do that's very similar to what Postman will do is when you have written a well-formed test, you can generate it as, you can copy it as a curl command. So if I do copy request as curl, now we'll see if I installed curl. I think I did. So same issue. It's giving me a good curl command, but it's not going to try to handle the self-signed cert for me, which no secure maybe? Can't remember what it is. So I've got a curl command, but I have to tell it to ignore that self-signed cert in order to get it to work. And I'm not going to make you watch me work my way through the man page to remember what that command is. And then it also has a really comprehensive list of code snippets, which I use this on a regular basis too. Like, so if I'm creating a new REST API and I've got a working test inside REST client here, now I want to go write some code to call the API. I can take the test that I've written, do generate code snippet. We've got a pretty good list of languages that it supports. So I just say, okay, I've written my API in C#. I'm going to write my client in C# too. So I want C#. And it says, okay, well, I can do it for you in the .NET Standard HTTP client, or I can use the REST Sharp library. Which one do you want? And depending on what I say, then it will generate a nice little block of code for me that I can just copy and paste into my project and call my new API. I'm sorry?
Does it have a test runner built into it?
A
Where you can basically tell it to run multiple requests against the endpoints?
I've got two answers to that. So the one thing that I mentioned is that you can write multiple requests and separate them with the three pound signs. So I can write, another get, a post, a delete. So you could go through something like post this, turn around and see if I can get the results back, and then delete it. So you could write a test like that, for example, and have it run all three requests in line. It also lets you do things like setting up variables. So where you could do a series of tests and then inject variables into the tests for different scenarios. I don't want to fumble through the syntax on that, but if you go to the extension, let me find, where are you at? So if I can remember how the alphabet works. So if you go and you open up the extension page, they've got a pretty extensive set of usage examples. So you can go down through here, see how to do the simplest, see how to do posts. If you continue on, how to do multiple. And I know that they've got variable examples down here. Where are you at? Oh, here's another handy one, is your post data. You don't have to do your post data in line in the test. So if you're doing a test and you want to post some standalone XML or some standalone JSON, you can have them in separate files, and you just use a caret to say, hey, rather than writing out the contents of the post, just pull it from this file. I'm not seeing, I know they're in here. Okay, trust me, they're here somewhere. I'm not going to scroll through all this.
How about the insertion library? Do you get access to the response within the script?
Yes. And I don't remember how to do it. So in other words, make a call, get a response, then do something with that response in line. Yes, and there's an example in here as well. But I have not done that for a long time, and I'm not going to try to fumble through it. But yeah. I remember I had to do some digging when that came up for me, but I know there's an example in here. You can see where I'm at. This thing goes on forever. Tons and tons and tons of examples. So this is one where if you're going to use REST client, you'll definitely want to read through the extension page.
Great tool for data validation. REST API.
One other thing I'm going to mention that is not VS Code related, I'm just going to mention it just in case it might be valuable to somebody here. First of all, I guess I should ask, anybody use Swagger? The CareSource folks do, I know that. What Swagger does for you, if you're not familiar, if you're working with APIs, Swagger basically gives you a pretty tester page that you can launch as a part of your API. And it used to be a little bit of work setting up the boilerplate for that. If you're using .NET, for example, it's setting up the boilerplate for that. With .NET 5, Swagger is now baked in. So when you generate a web API project, out of the gate, if you just add Swagger to the end of your URL, for crying out loud. Not with the endpoint. If you add Swagger to the end of your URL, you get the nice Swagger page. No extra work, just comes baked in. So that same default get endpoint that it created for us, we can go in here and we can test it. So yeah, if you're using .NET 5, just FYI, I just happened to stumble across that. Wow, okay, I am running pretty long on this. Sorry about that. But I am down to the last item that I'm going to demonstrate, and that's SQL Server. Now, I will not demonstrate this unless you really, really want to see it in person. What the SQL Server does is pretty self-explanatory. If you've installed the SQL Server extension, you can set up SQL Server connections and write queries inside VS Code. So let me close this. Actually, I will just go open the project. I have SQL Server Developer Edition running in Docker. You probably recall we saw it in Docker, but I will not fire it up just yet. But I will open up the project. Okay, so with SQL Server installed, let me go ahead and start it. It's hard to talk about it without showing anything. Hopefully my poor old laptop doesn't heel over. Okay, so I have SQL Server running in a Docker container now. With the SQL Server extension installed inside VS Code, you get an extra item on the panel over here for SQL Server that will show you any connections that you've set up. Connections are really easy to... Oh, this something else I forgot to mention. The VS Code settings are JSON based, and you can edit them directly. So you can go to a nice setting UI, and you can work with settings here. But if you prefer, and again, this is interchangeable, they'll keep each other synced. You can switch back and forth between both, and one will sync the other. You can work in the UI, or you can open the JSON directly. It's open settings JSON inside the command palette. Sometimes it's easier to work with the JSON. And I happen to think that SQL Server connections are one of those examples, because once you know the format of a SQL Server connection, it's really nice to, if you're working with multiple servers, just to copy paste that, tweak it a little bit, and you've got a new connection configured. So for SQL connections, all it needs to know is where the server is, if you want a default database, which is not required, how to connect to it. It will do either a SQL login, which is what I have here with Docker. I actually log in as SA. Or if you're in a corporate environment, it's more likely to be integrated security. And you can just say integrated and it'll work automatically. Tell it whether or not, once you've entered the password, do you want it retained so you don't have to enter it every time. And then what to name the profile. And that's it. Once you've specified this information, then over here inside SQL Server, you'll see that profile. If I expand it, it will connect automatically. And I get a nice view of my databases, which I don't have any yet, but we're going to fix that. Now that I have a working connection, I can go over here, I can write SQL, execute it against that connection. So I'm going to run this. It's going to prompt me, which connection do you want to use? I'll use the same one. It will run and show me my results. So command completed. If I go back over here, now this one I found you usually have to refresh it.
You have to do that Studio anyways.
What's that?
You have to do that with Microsoft Studio anyways.
So now I've got my new sample database. I haven't put any tables in it yet. So I'll close this. I will create a table. And we'll go ahead and jump ahead a little bit and populate that table with some sample data. Which this will actually insert the data and then turn right around and select from it and show me the results. The default layout is vertical. If you don't like that, which I like the vertical layout for most things, but not for SQL results. I prefer to have them top to bottom. So you can change that layout with toggle vertical horizontal editor layout and get a nicer view of your results down here. So we've got our database, we've added a table, we've added some sample data, and all through VS Code. Close. And then I can also go over here and expand this and expand my tables. And there's DBO customers. I can generate a select. I can generate create and drop scripts for the table. So that's SQL support inside VS Code. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention is there's another way, a very similar way that you can do this without using SQL Server Management Studio, because that's really my end game, is just not using SQL Server Management Studio. VS Code is nice, and VS Code is what I usually use, because mainly because I have all those extra extensions. So I can take data and I can do things like, for example, I've run a query and I've generated results, and now I want to take those results and save them, export them as CSV, and then I can turn around and use my cool Edit CSV extension to work with the data, or I can save it as JSON and use my JSON minifier before I send it somewhere. So I'm back to, hey, I've got all these tools set up that work together inside VS Code, and I can just kind of hand off from one to the other and do everything I need to do. But the tools for managing the database are not extensive inside the SQL Server extension for VS Code. So if you are coming from, I guess I would say more of a DBA type position where you want a little bit more management functionality, maybe more reporting, maybe extensions that are more geared toward database functions, then you might want to use something called Azure Data Studio. Azure Data Studio was actually built from VS Code, and the layout is identical, except it's completely database oriented. So what you can do if VS Code with SQL Server extension doesn't do everything you want, is just use Azure Data Studio instead. And by the way, I assure you all this runs very nice on a decent machine. So here inside Azure Data Studio, once it comes up, you'll see that very familiar layout. You can definitely tell where this came from. Very similar panel layout, except you do actually have more information that you can see. If, for example, you go here to SQL Server and you do manage. Now, one thing I noticed is running the Docker version. I don't see as much info. I don't know if it's a Docker issue, or it might be an issue with me running the developer edition of SQL Server. I'm not sure, but I know that when I run this against like the full version of SQL Server, I do see additional information. But already you can see that you're getting more information than you get over inside VS Code. So you get information about how much space your databases are using, what edition of SQL Server you're running. You get a nice, I think, a friendlier database list. See which databases are online. Some additional actions over here. Oh, and the notebooks, Azure Data Studio bakes in Jupyter, but for SQL Server. So what we were doing with Jupyter over in VS Code with Python, you can do with SQL inside Azure Data Studio. So I can write SQL code inside individual Jupyter cells, add markup, export it, just the way I did with the Python notebooks over in VS Code. And then if you look at the extensions for Azure Data Studio, you'll see an extension list that is very data oriented. So I haven't checked a lot of these out, and it has really grown. Azure Data Studio has only been out, I want to say, maybe 3 years-ish. And I know when I was first checking it out, there was maybe half a dozen extensions in here. And you have quite the list now. So yeah, if you're more interested in DBA stuff, this is definitely worth checking out, because you've got profilers and agent management and just all kinds of goodies in here that you don't get over in the VS Code version.
Performance tools?
Yes. And so it's not quite as comprehensive as SQL Server Management Studio, but it's comparable, and it's not as heavy. So that's that for SQL Server. And then just to wrap up, I don't have everything I just said. Think about what you want to do with SQL Server. And remember that, once again, you are not locking yourself into one or the other. The way I described how you just open a folder inside VS Code and it becomes a project, Azure Data Studio treats it the same way, and they play nice together. So open that folder of SQL scripts inside VS Code, do whatever you want with it. Open the same folder inside Azure Data Studio, do whatever you want to it, and just flip back and forth all you want. I actually do that quite a bit. I spend most of my time in VS Code working with SQL, but then every now and then when I want to get more database information or use a data-specific tool, I'll just toggle over to Azure Data Studio instead. So just kind of a quick laundry list of some other interesting extensions. If you happen to be working with mainframes, there is extensive extension support for mainframes. You've got editors that work with things like COBOL and PL1. You've got the Zoe Explorer for working with data sets and mainframe jobs, working with the Unix system services. You've got an IBM DB2 extension for working with the DB2 database. So if you happen to be spending time in there, you've got really good support for it inside VS Code. If you spend a lot of time in Java, I showed you the two I use the most because I don't spend a ton of time in Java. But there are loads of Java extensions. If you're working with Maven projects, if you want to set up test runners, you have extensions for that for Java. Lots and lots of UI framework specific support for things like Angular and Flutter and React and Vue. And then tons and tons of language support. If you're working with Dart or Go or PowerShell or Ruby, Rust, YAML. I forgot to mention Perl. There's Perl extensions as well. So, and then hundreds and hundreds that I haven't mentioned. It's fun to just explore. Every time I work with something new, even if it's something really esoteric, I always go and check out the extensions to see if there's something that will help me with this new thing that I'm working with, and it usually doesn't disappoint. And that's it. So if there's anything that I talked about that you have questions about, other extensions that you're interested in or want to learn about, or just basically anything around what I've talked about, you can reach me at that. And I'm also active on Google Chat at the same address. So thank you very much.